Hi, I'm Jamie, and today I'm going to be talking about the Udmurt people of modern-day Russia and how their issues relate to issues other Indigenous people that we might be more familiar with here in Saskatchewan face. The Udmurt speak a Finno-Ugric language, which is in the same group that includes the Sami, the Finns, and the Hungarians. It's pre-Indo-European, which is a fancy way of saying it's spoken by a people who have lived in that region for a very, very, very long time, probably since before agriculture was invented. There's a few ways that you can say Udmurt. I prefer Udmurt, as you've been hearing so far, but Udmurt is also acceptable. Many people still call them Votyaks, which, although it doesn't have direct negative meaning, it has become somewhat of a slur over the time that it's been used. There's another very important term, which I will use later, which is Vus, which refers to any number of spiritual activities, such as praying, sacrificing, having faith, or something being sacred. The Udmurts have never really had a state of their own. They've been claimed by other people throughout time. We don't hear much about them until the days of Russia, when they invaded other former Mongol states, like the Golden Horde and the Kazan Khanate. In 1552 is when the area of Udmurtia was formally annexed. At the time, they had fairly high autonomy. They were subject to a quit tax, which meant that although they had to pay taxes, they did not receive services, but they also did not have to be raised in war as levies, which was something that they didn't want to do. They have as I will talk about later, they are not a very violent people. In the later Russian Empire, more and more control was attempted to be enforced over that region as the resources of Siberia became more and more important. A large road was constructed in the north of Udmurtia, which I will talk about a bit more later. And a large steelworks was also constructed in that area, particularly because the wood there was very good for fuel, and the rivers there were very good for cooling, although the Udmurts, even if they had wanted to, did not have the option to work in this facility. In the days of the Soviets, in the early days of the Soviets, they had hope that they would have more representation. And it was true that in much of the 1920s, things were looking pretty good for the Udmurts. But as the Soviet Union became more and more authoritarian as we approached World War II, they started to strengthen their control over the Udmurts and suppress their religion, suppress their language, and suppress their ability to exist in a government space. Later parts of the Soviet Union attempted to rectify this, and I should say that in air quotes. Their attempt to allow Udmurts to occupy government positions was more of an attempt to convince them to become Russian, because you had to have a Russian name, you had to speak the Russian language, and you could not practice your native religion at the time. So it was quite unfortunate, but a very, ruthlessly clever way to assimilate people. A similar hope was felt when the Soviet Union started collapsing, and the modern Udmurt Republic as we know it was established after the fall of the Soviet Union. Things were looking good. Their constitution allowed for their religion. It allowed for them to speak their language, and certain concessions about their language being spoken in schools. I will speak later about why this hope has died down and why it was not realized. They don't appear the same way that many people in Canada imagine an Indigenous person to appear, but they do have very similar cultural activities to those practiced here in North America. They are sedentary people. They live in small villages scattered throughout the meadows of their forest, which is where their name comes from. It means the meadow people. They have many similarities with their neighboring cultures, especially the Mari. They've had lots of contact with the Tatars, where they've gained a few words from them, and they have had lots of contact with the Russians. Many Udmurts assimilate into the Russian culture even today. The northern part of Udmurtia is much more Russified. Their culture has been more assimilated there, I should say. This is due in part to the road that was constructed there, which brought them into direct contact with larger amounts of Russian settlers. They have dark hair, and they have much more words in their language from other languages that have moved there. Whereas in the south, they generally have lighter colored hair, and they still live a very traditional way, similar to the way they lived even before the Russians showed up. They do have their own religion, as I mentioned, which is Vus. Unlike the religions in North America, I should say the religions in North America, they were polytheistic. They believed in many gods, not just a single creator and then powerful spirits. They did believe in many individual gods who partook in creation individually. And they practiced something called numinous animism, which is that the evidence for objects containing their own individual spirits, much like objects here believed by the native people here are believed to contain spirits. It is evident by the fact that they are splendorous. They have a certain feeling to them which provides the justification for why every object has a spirit. It has been significantly suppressed over time. They're believed to be pagans, to be witches, to be devil worshippers. I mean, they are pagans, but they were believed to be evil. And for that reason, many people, even today, actively hide the fact that they practice their traditional religion, which is very unfortunate. In the 20th century, significant Christianization took place, particularly in the north. Many people in the north of Udmurtia who still practice their traditional lifestyles have been converted to Christian, though, as well. They are non-violent. They've never engaged in wide-scale war or even small-scale war. They've basically lived the same way they have for a very long time. There's two major spiritual locations. I will start with the Kuala, which is just a word for a temple. You can see one there, which is a sort of a tent-like structure, but you will also find ones that just look like little houses in a field, but they will contain altars and ritual spaces. There is also the Lud, which is a sacred grove or a sacred place, which there are not many of those right now. They're being actively removed, unlike sacred spaces, say, in North America, which are removed under the auspice of progress or whatnot. The sacred spaces of the Udmurts are more actively being removed because many believe them to be tainted places, tainted by the religion of the Udmurt, which shows that it speaks to the level of distrust that the other people of the Udmurt Republic and the Udmurts themselves feel to their identities. There are a lot of huge issues facing the Udmurts right now. Language loss is a big one. Only 1 in 3 Udmurts can speak their own native language. Many of the articles that I've read of interviews with people say that people feel extremely ashamed of being an Udmurt and that they will actively go apart hiding their identity, even if they do practice at home. which is quite similar to many of the ways, many of the things people here in North America have been feeling. They have an extremely high suicide rate and rate of drug addiction, among the highest in the Soviet Union and among the highest in the world. They are a minority in their own republic, but not by an amount that is significantly high. For example, about 30% of people in Udmurtia right now are Udmurts, but which is comparable to the number of First Nations people living in, say, in the Northwest Territories. Just as a reference point for people who are familiar with Canada here. Their population has been decreasing by about 10,000 people every 5 years. Many of them have been lost to assimilation, but in part due to the high suicide rate and the low birth rates and the restricted access to health care, has been decreasing their population through biological means as well as cultural means. So they are at a severe risk of being gone in the immediate future. On September the 10th, there was a major protest for a law that had been passed by the Moscow Assembly, which would make it so that schools in predominantly Udmurt communities do not have to teach the Udmurt language. Already, the high schools did not teach Udmurt. The universities did not teach Udmurt. Only daycares and elementary schools had classes in Udmurt. And this law would make it so that even that was not a guarantee. A particularly notable, well, at least if you were around in the region, he was quite well known in that area, activist and professor at the university, Albert Razin, created a protest outside of the legislative building in Izvest, and it's quite unfortunate what happened later. Nobody really listened to him. You can watch the video of him speaking, which I do suggest. His own words on the subject I find are much more moving than mine could ever be as a disconnected viewer from the outside here. He had some signs. One of the signs said, "If my language will die tomorrow, I should die today." And that is in fact what happened. Only a few hours after him being ignored by the people at the legislative building, he doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire, which I don't need to say is quite brutal. You can find images and videos of this on the internet, but I did not link or show them because it is quite gruesome. And I think what I really want to hammer home with this presentation is that people all over the world are facing similar issues, but the solutions they have are very different because of the environment they're in and their history. There's no giant bandage we can stick anywhere in the world and it'll just fix any Indigenous issues. And I also want to show that there's Indigenous people everywhere, and many of them are hidden just because they're not a very publicly conforming group of individuals. And that's very tragic, that nobody knows about the fact that these people are facing very, very similar issues to the ones here, and they've been almost completely ignored by any media anywhere. If I had not been researching this for an unrelated topic, I would have never seen the video of Albert Razin and his protest. I would have never chosen this. I wouldn't have run into it. And that's true of groups all over the world. And I implore other people who are listening to this to go somewhere and look for an Indigenous group in a place that you might not think there would be an Indigenous group, and see what issues they are facing. And another thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that cultural extinction is not a thing of the past. It's not that, let's say, for example, the Beothuk people, they went extinct. Things like that don't happen anymore. We're a more enlightened people. We're not. People can still go extinct now, and if something isn't done to change, the Udmurt people will be extinct by maybe 50 years in the future? Who knows? And it's really tragic that such a thing can occur without anyone noticing. I also want to emphasize that appearance is not what makes someone indigenous. What makes someone indigenous is the way they live and the way they perceive the world and understand the sacred spaces of the area in which they live. And for closing off, I just want to show you the resources that I used. I linked every single resource that provided information for this PowerPoint so that you can read it yourself, which I do strongly suggest that you should do. It's very interesting. And I guess I just want to thank you again for choosing my video, and I hope that this has expanded your knowledge on Indigenous peoples throughout Europe, and particularly of the issues that are facing the Udmurt people, and maybe you have some ideas of what we can do to help them improve their situation. Thank you, and have a great day.